afternoon, everybody. What's that? It is. It's all the usual suspects. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Stackhouse. I'm the Director of Development here at the Library of Virginia Foundation. And it's nice to see so many folks out on a very, although I was going to say rainy, but the sun is out for like 5 minutes. But very much springtime weather here in Virginia. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. I'm curious if any of you are here in the Library of Virginia for the very first time. Anybody? Or are here for a book talk for the first time. If you are, welcome. I hope you will come back and see us again. We have these pretty much kind of weekly, bi-weekly here during, we slow down a little bit as we get into the spring and summertime, but it's a great way to highlight the best of Virginia authors and the best of Virginia literature here at the library, which we're very proud to do. I hope you all had a chance to sign up. We are giving away a copy of the book today. There was a chance to sign up outside. That we'll be doing that drawing at the end, right before Ms. Peters is available to sign copies of her book, which are also for sale out there. As I mentioned, I am with the Library of Virginia Foundation. We are a private 501c3 that supports the efforts of the library. We do things like this, like our book talk series, educational programming, conservation, things that the state either can't or sometimes chooses not to fund. We pick up the slack and try to support the library in that way. If I can provide you with any information about how you can become a member and all the wonderful benefits of membership, including discounts at the wonderful Virginia shop, please see me and let me know. Hopefully, if you don't already receive it, you saw a copy of our Broadside magazine out in the lobby. This is our quarterly publication, which is this is the fourth one now. So we are rounding up on a year of broadsides. It's been a wonderful addition for us to be able to let people know about everything that's happening here at the library. So if you would like to receive it and don't already, make sure you fill out a card and we'll get your name on the mailing list. It is now my pleasure to introduce Nikki Robner. Nikki is the, make sure I get this right, Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and she's going to be introducing today's speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I was so honored to be asked to participate in this event today and to introduce Ms. Peters. I was excited about the book before I ever knew about today's event. If you don't already have a copy, here's what it looks like. And the reason that I find it so exciting is because I really think it's wonderful to have the opportunity to learn about some of the giants on whose shoulders we stand. And I see many colleagues in the audience of folks who work in some of the natural resources agencies, and if you ever wondered why we have a Virginia Outdoors Foundation or a Department of Historic Resources and what their origin was, you can learn about it in this book. And we all, I think, have had the pleasure of getting to know over the years one of the giants, and that's Taylor Murphy, because he honored us by coming back and serving as Secretary of Natural Resources after his long tenure in the legislature. But there are others in this book that you'll learn about, George Freeman and Fitzgerald Bemis, who really were the thought leaders behind a lot of what we do and what we're able to do as dedicated employees of these natural resources agencies. And it's really inspiring to read their story, and I'm so grateful to Ms. Peters for taking on the task of writing this book. She has a wonderful background for having done so. After having attended Vassar College, she had a 34-year career at the Department of Historic Resources, which, as you'll learn in the book, if you don't already know, began as the Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission many years ago. She served in many roles at Historic Resources, did a lot of work putting together nominations for the National Historic Landmarks Register and the State Register, and in fact continued in that role after retiring from the department, and did so as a private consultant. And so just probably any historic place that you can think about in Virginia that you have questions about, I believe Ms. Peters could probably answer it. Jackson Ward, one of the largest African American district, is one of the things that she worked on. She also served as a public information officer for the Department of Historic Resources, and she also served as manager of the Historic Highway Marker Program. and in fact has written a book on that subject as well, the guidebook to Virginia historical markers. And she also co-authored a book with her husband on Virginia's historic courthouses. So really just a really wonderful wealth of information about our historic resources, and it's wonderful that she's taken on this broader topic of conservation generally in Virginia and the history of that, and we're so lucky that we're going to get to hear from her today. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Peters.
Thank you very much, and for coming out on a rather dreary day. I want to make a couple of quick acknowledgments before I begin, because this book would not have happened without the inspiration of Fitzgerald Bemis. He was truly when I was first working for the Department of Historic Resources, was sort of the godfather of the historic preservation program, since he was the one who had the idea for creating the agency that ended up giving me employment for the succeeding 3 decades. But he was and continues to be a real inspiration, and my conversations and meetings with him in the course of writing this book were sort of an affirmation of all that I had always believed about him. A couple of the other people whose names I want to mention, obviously George Freeman, who was very instrumental in providing a lot of the legal underpinning for the environmental law in Virginia, and Michael Lipford, who is head of the Nature Conservancy in Virginia, which has been probably one of the most critical private partners in addressing Virginia's environmental needs. Here we are celebrating Earth Day, I think it's this Wednesday, in 2009. On April 22nd, 1970, just about 40 years ago, Virginia celebrated its first Earth Day that was held in Richmond's historic Monroe Park, which I am fortunate enough to be able to overlook from my present residence. Linwood Holton was governor, and he chose to participate in Virginia's first Earth Day, much to the consternation of some of his staff, who were a little bit concerned about him becoming involved in what they saw as sort of a hippie movement, if you will, of the 1970s. He was the newly elected governor of Virginia. Earth Day in Virginia was organized by students at VCU, which also is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And I think that Holton, and Governor Holton told me this personally, was very impressed with the constructive energy and enthusiasm displayed by the students. And he chose, I think, at that time to pursue a course during his tenure in office to address issues of the environment. But a decade earlier was when the real seeds of the environmental movement were sown in Virginia, in the living room of Elizabeth Scott Bocock, who at a meeting whose leading participants were a young state legislator, Fitzgerald Bemis, and an even younger attorney, George Freeman, the Virginia chapter of the Nature Conservancy was formed. 4 years later, the Virginia General Assembly adopted a resolution creating the Virginia Outdoor Recreation Study Commission, which is a real mouthful, and even if you use the acronym VORSC, that's a lot to remember. In any case, that commission was appointed by Governor Harrison to make recommendations for improving the state's outdoor recreation facilities, notably its state parks. Governor Harrison appointed Jerry Bemis to chair that committee, and he appointed Harry Byrd Jr. as the vice chairman, which was an important selection, not only for Jerry, because he was obviously the intellectual and in part political power on the committee, but selecting Harry Byrd Jr. was important as well, because the governor realized full well that without the political savvy, such legislation that might flow from this committee might never happen. And Jerry told me in my conversations with him that the appointment of Harry Burr Jr. was very important to the success of this Recreation Study Commission. Now, the whole concept of recreation, it was somewhat of an antique reference to outdoor land, space, open things, and so what this commission did under Jerry's leadership was to expand on the whole concept of outdoor recreation to address all of Virginia's environmental resources, including not only open space, parks, clean water and rivers, the bay, but also historic buildings. And the inclusion of historic buildings in the concept of environmental issues was an important and an absolutely critical step in where historic preservation found itself in the whole panoply of state bureaucracy. The Outdoor Recreation Study Commission was modeled on the National Outdoor Recreation Study Commission, which had been chaired by Lawrence Rockefeller. And Lawrence Rockefeller was a friend of Jerry Bemis's, and I'm sure that the Outdoor Recreation Study Commission on the national level, which had preceded this, was very instrumental in shaping Jerry's thinking about where Virginia would go. I think they expanded the vision, as I've said, of improving parks to conserving open space and historic landmarks. I want to read very briefly from the publication that grew out of this commission, which was very appropriately named Virginia's Commonwealth. Sort of a play on the name of the state, but looking at what the wealth of resources that Virginia is blessed with, what could be done for them. They came up with 8 recommendations. The first was the Open Space Land Act, which provided for the acquisition and designation of real property by public bodies for the use as permanent open space, protecting open land, which was a completely new concept of government playing a specific role and it not being left only to the private property owner. A commission of outdoor recreation, which again was to look at the whole panoply of environmental issues. Zoning enabling legislation. This was very important because what it did was to create legislation that would allow local governments to include conservation and historic preservation in their comprehensive plans, and it was actually ultimately mandated by state legislation. A scenic highway and historic road system. You've seen many of Virginia's wonderful historic byways, and it was an important part of the thinking of the commission that not only were historic parks and open space and historic landmarks important, but the roadways that people must travel to reach them. And that was a concept, again, that had never really been focused on before. The other, obviously, large recommendation was to create a Historic Landmarks Commission. And the Historic Landmarks Commission was charged with making a survey of the historic properties in Virginia and to assist and be the advocate for their preservation. And that agency succeeds today and exists as the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. The other agency that was created was the Virginia Outdoors Foundation. And the Virginia Outdoors Foundation was to accept private conservation easements on open space around the state. The last and probably one of the most important elements of their recommendations was the Virginia Park Revenue Bond Act Amendment. And what this did, and for a state that had always clung to the pay-as-you-go type philosophy of the Byrd political machine, allowing the state to issue revenue bonds to acquire and develop and maintain state parks was a very, very important movement. Now understand this was taking place in 1965 and 66. But aside from the, forgot one thing. One of the things that was going on at this time that Virginia's Commonwealth was being written and developed was a conference entitled the Beauty for America Conference, which was set up by Lyndon Johnson. And Senator Bemis, Jerry Bemis, was selected by Governor Harrison to represent Virginia. And Jerry actually led the session on the new suburbia. And the reason that's important, aside from the fact that he did a marvelous job in leading that particular study, is that it tended to be the first time that I think Jerry had begun to articulate his concerns about overwhelming suburban development and its impact on the environment. I think that one of the most important things about these early years of the environmental movement in Virginia is the fact that there were what Dick Howard has referred to as the golden age of environmental leadership. You had Linwood Holton, who as governor took on a number of issues, creating the Council on the Environment in particular, which ensured that there would be communication among state agencies when it came to the treatment of natural and historic resources. Obviously, George Freeman, who pursued actively the whole issue of providing legal justification for the various types of land conservation. Obviously, Jerry Bemis himself, and Dick Howard. Dick Howard, who is a personal friend of mine, is a professor of law at the University of Virginia and has been responsible for crafting constitutions for countries around the world. But his important role when it comes to considering Virginia's environment was his drafting of Virginia's Constitution from 1970. Virginia had not had a new constitution in nearly 7 decades, and the important thing about Dick's work in writing this constitution, he was the person charged with actually producing the drafts, was to establish a paragraph in the Constitution that referred to the lands and resources of the Commonwealth. And I want to read you just the first part of it because it's very important to understand that this constitutional justification or underpinning became important for leaders in succeeding decades who pursued preservation and conservation efforts. To the end that the people have clean air, pure water, and the use and enjoyment for recreation of adequate public lands, waters, and other natural resources, it shall be the policy of the Commonwealth to conserve, develop, and utilize its natural resources, its public lands, and its historic sites and buildings. Now understand that this was an incredible statement to happen at that particular time. Several states had made jabs at including conservation and preservation efforts in their constitutions, but none with the the beauty of the words and the wordsmithing of this particular section of Virginia's Constitution. And it is really upon that particular constitutional entry for Virginia that much of Virginia's environmental work has proceeded since then. What we did in this book, and the book in many ways was very much of a team effort because George, Michael, Jerry, and I all worked on various portions of it to be sure that we didn't miss anything critical. And later Taylor Murphy, who didn't come along until the early 1980s in government, but who became one of the strongest advocates for the Chesapeake Bay. We felt that addressing the early years of the environmental movement was important, not only for the for recording it, and as an historian that was one of my primary goals, but also to inspire the present generations to know that there were people, individuals, who truly made a difference. Once we had gone through the various ups and downs of the environmental movement during the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and there were lots of ups and downs. The decade of the 1970s was very much of an environmental decade, if you will, on a national scale. It was when many of the acts that on a national level that had been enacted, ensuring clean air, clean water, the National Historic Preservation Act, all took place. And there was, if you all can recall, and some of you look old enough to remember back to the early years of the 1970s, there was a real national sentiment for looking at the problems of our environment and the fact that the environmental resources that we all enjoyed were indeed remarkably fragile and needed specific attention, and government had a very definite role to play. That carried over until beginning in the early 1980s, when there was a far greater movement to diminish the role and responsibilities of government and to promote economic growth and development. You know, we all went through in the 1970s an economic crisis, and the response to that was we've really got to encourage economic growth and development. That was looked upon as the sort of end-all. And in that process, many times the environment came in second. So besides promoting economic growth, which tended to be detrimental to the environment if it were not properly regulated and controlled, there also was an anti or a small government movement that really didn't feel that government had a critical role to play. So if you trace some of the legislation and some of the political thinking that went over that covered those various decades, you'll see a change in the 1980s. And it really wasn't until the late part of that decade and the 1990s that we began to recapture that commitment not only to private involvement in conservation and preservation efforts, but official state involvement. So what we did in putting together the book was to discuss the 4 specific areas that were of real, that seemed to capture what the environmental movement was like over the period of its inception to about 1990. One, of course, was open space conservation, historic preservation, state parks, and the Chesapeake Bay. And I think that probably the biggest success stories, and I was asked this in an interview not long ago, were obviously the Virginia Open Space Land Act and land conservation, the Historic Preservation Program, which has not only saved many buildings, but has provided an economic stimulus to many, many localities in Virginia. Virginia being the state, and I think I can say this without reservation, with one of the richest collections of historic resources in the entire nation. And various tax incentives, as well as the inspiration of local groups, and led by the Department of Historic Resources, has been a remarkably successful program over its history. And the expansion of state parks. When state parks were first established back in the 1930s, all but, well, two of them were located in the eastern part of the state, one in Westmoreland County, one down in Virginia Beach. But most of the land that was actually protected with state parks was in the western part of the state, which was not what you would consider accessible to those large numbers of people that lived in the eastern half of the Commonwealth. So the development of state parks has been I think has been a remarkable success story in Virginia's environmental legacy. And today we have parks, and one of the appendices in the books lists all of the parks along with the dates when they were established. And I think you will see that that particular legacy is one of immeasurable value to the quality of life in the state of Virginia. I think probably the biggest challenge and probably the biggest problem in the environmental panoply across the Commonwealth is that of the Chesapeake Bay. Current news articles have underscored that particular problem. I think we all are very, very much aware of it. It is so large. It is a problem that is almost difficult to get your arms around. The Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest inland estuaries in the entire world. It has been addressed by incredible efforts on the part of many of the states that surround the bay, often inspired by Taylor Murphy, who played an important role in securing the cooperative efforts of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia, along with Virginia. But the Bay is truly one of those challenges that I am sure today in all the natural resource areas is one of real difficulty. I'm not sure how it can be addressed. There have been a number of efforts focused on the Bay. One of the biggest problems is development as a whole. Understand that the quality of water, and I'm sure I'm speaking to people who probably know more technically about this than I do, but the quality of the water in the Bay is ultimately affected by the quality of the water of the rivers that empty into it. Farming and agricultural practices for centuries have been a problem with their effect on the quality of the bay water. One of the illustrations that we have in this book is of a couple of sites actually in Maryland, one of which shows the development, large condominiums and a shopping center, I think, that come right up to the shores of the bay waters. The other one shows open farmland that is well screened by vegetation between the bay itself and the farmed land. And the contrast is striking, and I think that it involves educating farmers, developers, the impact of highways and parking lots where water runs off and runs right into the bay is one that is an incredibly difficult one. And I think that it is the one area that I think, although much has been done and incredible resources have been devoted to, is one that is going to take us decades to even begin to to solve. I want to say that I saw this book as a jumping off point, hopefully an inspiration for more in-depth writing and consideration of the environmental movement in the future. And what we pray jointly Virginia will look like 50 to 100 years from now. This book is not a lengthy book. We wanted to write it so that it would be accessible to the public, that it would inspire the public. I hope it substantiates the premise that individual men and women are indeed agents of change. I think we often tend to sort of throw up our arms in a mass society and say the individual doesn't have any impact. The individual does. And the leadership that Virginia provided in the 1960s and 70s, both inside and out of government, were extraordinary. And I think we need to remember that and to keep it in mind as we move forward. They deserve to be remembered and hopefully emulated in the coming years. I felt a little bit awkward in a way trying to summarize this book in a presentation because of course I want you all to read it. But I do think that as you read, keep in mind that all of us are responsible for the irreplaceable and stunning resources that this Commonwealth has. Thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take any questions. I will try to answer them as best I can, and I hope that afterward, if you have any other questions you'd like to address personally, I'll be glad to entertain those as well. Thank you. Ray, you're a friend of everyone. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Ray, coming from you. Ray has always been a friend of the conservation movement, and when I worked in government, we knew the legislators who were helpful and those that were not. Believe me. We weren't allowed to say much, but we all knew who they were. So, any other questions? Yes, Laura. It was unusual, and you know, it's very interesting. My experience was in the 1980s, for a brief time, the Department of Historic Resources was actually located within the Department of Division of, I can't remember, but anyway, we were all together in one department with water, air, and parks. And I remember I served on a committee that was trying to find the sort of common thread that would link those resources. And it was a challenge, and I think a lot of people did not at that time acknowledge that historic buildings and districts were part of the environment. Environment sort of meant air and water. It didn't necessarily mean buildings and historic districts or historic landscapes. And I think that over the years that has changed, and I think that more and more there is obviously an acknowledgement and a recognition that the areas in which we live are all part of our environment. And water can be cleaned, hopefully. Air can be cleaned, hopefully. But an historic building is irreplaceable. And once it's torn down, it's gone. So the discussions did take place, I'm sure. And I think that it's the reason we all look to Jerry Bemis as very young state employees back in the 1970s. I see Calder Loth here. Calder was there at the same time. And we welcomed the recognition and sort of bringing us into the environmental fold. Yes, there was another question. Yes, Brett. Well, you know, it's very interesting. That was an extremely, and I do discuss that issue in here. The interesting thing about the Keepone case, and for those of you all that don't recall, Allied Signal, which is now Honeywell Corporation, actually was producing or manufacturing a pesticide, one of whose prime components was a chemical called Keepone. And what they were doing is that they were dumping the waste from this manufacturing project directly into the river at Hopewell. Lawsuits were brought, and ultimately Allied was forced to pay a lot of money in damages and to clean up the river. But one of the interesting things that the federal courts did at that time was to require that Allied provide enough money to establish a permanent endowment. And it was called the Virginia Environmental Endowment, and it still exists. Its first director was Jerry McCarthy, who is still its director. And one of the goals, or one of the responsibilities of the Virginia Environmental Endowment was to assist not only in funding small projects around the state, but particularly in the area of education, of getting the word out and educating local governments, local businesses as to the importance of preserving the environment. So from my perspective, I think that the Keepone thing was one of the first times that the federal courts had actually stepped in and said, you must set up a fund that will be ongoing. And obviously it's gone on for 40 years and is still very active today. Other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Another round of applause, please, for Margaret Peters. It's a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed the comments today. And here at the library, when we get ready to do planning, we all obviously look for opportunities when there are things on the calendars to highlight, and that's why we invited you today with Earth Day coming up. But I think for our nation and our globe, it is such a very important topic. And what I gather from your talk and what I read of the book is the lesson that there have been a lot of sacrifices made, and that we really need to continue to push forward and make sure that we make sure that the resources that we have are carried on for the next generation. So thank you for your work on that. On behalf of Sandy Treadway, the state librarian, and all of the staff here at the library, as a thank you to you, Margaret, if you come up, I have a small token of our esteem. I heard you talk about the state report called The Commonwealth. I guess a great idea is often repeated. What I have for you today is a copy of the library's book called The Commonwealth, which is a highlight of the treasures that we have in our collection. But I hope that you would accept this as a token of our esteem and for your time coming out today. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And one last thing, as a thank you to all of you for taking the time out to come and be a part of the program, we are going to have a drawing for a free copy of the book today. So I'm going to ask Margaret to stick her hand in the box. I
don't like to pull because for our repeat visitors, if they don't get their names pulled, they accuse me. So,
Allison L. Taylor White.
speaking of repeat visitors, Allison. All right. Well, you get to claim your free
I've
book.
done Allison and I'm very good. Oh, that's why I put you down. Yeah, me
All right, well, thank you, and that concludes our program. You can join us. We have books for sale, and Margaret will be with us in the lobby to sell those as well. So again, thank you, and hope to see you again soon.